Hello and welcome to the short Vort on the double Parsha of Behar and Bechukosai. This series is dedicated to Fuah Shlema of Mori Naftali ben Yitta. Rabbi Kerzner on Torah Anytime on Parsha Behar uses it to discuss the topic of tips. Are tips an obligation? Are they discretionary? Are they forbidden? So in Behar it talks about, in Perek Chavhei, it talks about an Eved Ivri, and when the Eved goes free, the halacha is that they don't go barren, they can't go empty-handed. You have to give them certain parting gifts so that they can transition to a life without a master who's feeding them. And from that, we learn the halacha of tips. So Belsky and Rabbi Elyashiv make a distinction between two types of services. And the topic is in the Gemara Megillah Daf Chav Vav, where when the visitors went up for the Shlosh Regalim to Yerushalayim, they had to stay overnight. They didn't have places to dwell, and the local inhabitants of Yerushalayim were now at a charge for hosting these people. But the Torah says that since one of the things that the visitors did for the Regalim was to bring Korbanos Shlamim, that they had offerings to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so they would take the hides, the oros, and give them as a tip, as it were, as a hakaras hatov to their hosts. And so that's where we learn halachas of tip. Belsky and Rabbi Elyashiv said that there's a distinction to be made to understand when it's obligation or discretionary. If it's a universal minhag to give a tip, such as in the U.S., a taxi driver or a waiter in a restaurant, then it's an obligation to give a tip. And if you don't give a tip, that's actually a chashash gezel. That might be considered stealing. But if something's not expected universally and it's not part of the assumed compensation, such as maybe a barista in Starbucks, not everybody tips there, then it's derech eretz. It's a nice thing to do, but it is not an obligation. It is not a chiyuv. Moving on to the second parsha, Bechukosai. So Perek Chaf Vav Pasuk Gimel and Bechukosai telech you if you will follow my decrees. Rabbi Y.Zilberstein in Aleinu L'shabei'ach tells us about the house of Rabbi Tzvi Shrag Grossbard. Often had different mashkichim come to visit him. One of them was Rabbi Elyashiv. And whenever Rabbi Lapian would visit, he would whisper into the ear of one of Rabbi Grossbard's children, and he would give them a dvar musar thought. One time, Rabbi Elia gave a musar thought to the young Rivka Grossbard, the daughter, and he quoted the pasuk of Shalom Rav LOVE Torah. There's abundant peace for those who love your Torah. Ve'ein lamo michshol. And there is no stumbling block in that. That's from Tehillim Kuf Yud Tes 165. And then he added that there are those who study Torah and those who love Torah. He said those who study Torah, those are the men. They have an obligation to go out and they can't waste time from learning. And if they waste time, then there's a big punishment for that bittul Torah. Those who love Torah are the women. She told to Rivka, like your mother, who are dedicated to helping their husbands with their Torah study and sharing and spreading Torah. But he says for them, the pasuk is there is no stumbling block. Because these women who love the Torah and devote themselves for doing everything they can there, and they have no obligation to do so, they cannot be punished for anything. So there's no stumbling block for women for bittul Torah. So it reminds me about, if a husband goes out at night to learn for an hour, and he bottles away, he wastes 15 minutes, he's only going to get credit for 45 minutes for getting about any punishment for the actual act of batala. But the wife who is willing to give up her time with her spouse for that hour, even with batala, she gets full credit for the hour. So we learn today, in summary, two things in Behar. We can learn about tips, that if it's part of the person's compensation and it's expected, then it's an obligation to tip. If it's something that is not an obligation, not everyone does so, then it's only a derech eretz, but not an obligation to give. And among those, the distinction between those who love Torah and those who study Torah, it's the men who study the Torah. They can't be punished for not doing so. But the women who love Torah and support the men who study, and they study something on their own, there is no stumbling block for them. Thank you. Like, share, and subscribe. Have a wonderful week and a wonderful Shabbos.